He didn't need headlines. He wrote history in silence. Chicago, 1906. The city was a furnace of smoke and iron, where the clang of factory steel mixed with the whispers of the hungry. Steam bled from sewer grates, and the stench of sweat and coal lingered in the alleys. In those narrow streets, where rats scurried between garbage cans and broken dreams, a boy named Antonino Leonardo Accardo took his first breath. His parents had come from Sicily chasing hope, but what they found was survival. The tenements were stacked like tombs, one on top of another, filled with immigrants who spoke in dialects the city didn't care to understand. For a Sicilian kid on Chicago's west side, life offered two choices: obey or vanish. Tony chose neither. He learned to adapt, to blend in, to disappear until he was ready to strike. By 10, he was running small hustles, shining shoes, carrying groceries, keeping an eye on who walked the block and who didn't. By 12, he was skipping school to hang around the pool halls and corner bars where men in sharp suits whispered about business. They weren't talking about selling candy. They were talking about stuff: numbers, liquor, and protection. Chicago was already a kingdom of vice, ruled not by politicians or priests, but by men who believed in loyalty, cash, and silence. Tony absorbed everything. He didn't just watch, he studied. He memorized faces, gestures, the way real power never raised its voice. When a man shouted, he was weak. When he whispered, he owned the room. That lesson became his religion. By 16, Tony wasn't just another street kid. He was moving messages for the Chicago outfit, running errands that others were too scared to touch. He never asked questions, never looked nervous, never got caught. Word spread fast. The kid from the alleys didn't talk, didn't brag, and didn't miss. In a world built on paranoia, that kind of silence was gold. He earned his first nickname the hard way. A small-time thief tried to skim money from a protection job. The boss asked Tony to handle it. He didn't hesitate. No guns, no shouting, just a baseball bat and cold precision. When it was over, the man who'd stolen was unrecognizable. Al Capone, who'd been watching from the sidelines, laughed and said, "This kid's the real deal. He's Joe Batters." The name stuck. The legend began. But Accardo wasn't chasing reputation. He didn't crave the spotlight like Capone or Nitti. He preferred the edges of the frame, the quiet corners where no one looked. While others counted money and bragged to newspapers, Tony counted weaknesses. He saw that the real key to survival wasn't fear. It was control. When the city roared during Prohibition, with beer trucks rolling through police barricades and speakeasies blooming like weeds, Tony kept his voice low. He ran routes, managed drivers, and made sure shipments arrived. On time, untouched, unseen. He learned how to bribe the right man without making him feel bought, how to threaten without raising a hand. Every move was a calculation, every silence a weapon. He walked through Chicago like a shadow stitched to the skyline. The stockyards bled, the river stank of waste, and the nights belonged to men with guns. But Tony, he was different. He was patient. While Capone was making headlines, Tony was making history in the dark. He studied the balance of power between the Irish mobs, the Sicilians, the Italians. He knew who was going to die before they did. And he learned something else. When the noise gets too loud, the smart man leaves the room. By the time he was in his 20s, Accardo was more than an enforcer. He was an apprentice to the throne. He'd seen men rise fast and fall faster. He had seen drunks brag about their kills one night and end up in Lake Michigan the next. He understood that the streets didn't reward brutality. They rewarded discipline. Tony didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't gamble. He watched others drown in their vices while he sharpened his focus. His weapon wasn't rage, it was restraint. To the untrained eye, he was calm. To those who knew better, that calm was the warning before the storm. The outfit needed men who could be trusted to do more than kill. They needed men who could think. Tony Accardo became that man. In a city where survival was a coin toss, he never left it to chance. He moved through life like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to stop. Every decision, every silence, every calculated nod built a foundation that would one day carry the weight of an empire. Because Tony understood something most men never would. Power doesn't shout, power whispers. Accardo studied men the way priests study scripture, patiently, reverently, searching for divine patterns in the chaos of sin. Every man he met was a lesson. How they spoke, how they lied, how they died. He understood that fear makes men loud, but respect keeps them quiet. And in a world where everyone was shouting for power, Tony learned the value of silence. When Al Capone rose like a storm over Chicago, Tony was there, a young soldier with eyes sharper than bullets. He watched Capone turn the city into his empire, beer trucks rolling through barricades, cops on payrolls, judges bought like cheap cigars. But he also watched how the same noise that built Capone would destroy him. The headlines, the attention, the ego. It was all poison wrapped in applause. When Capone fell to prison, Tony didn't flinch. He didn't rush for the throne like the rest. He waited, just as he always did. Patience wasn't a weakness, it was strategy. He learned early that every man who grabs too fast ends up choking on his own ambition. Then came Frank Nitti, the new boss, smoother, more cautious, but still too visible. Nitti liked the limelight, the tailored suits, the big cars, the reporters calling his name. Tony stayed in the background, saying little, watching everything. He studied Nitti's moves the way a hunter studies prey. Calm, methodical, inevitable. And when Nitti fell too, taking a bullet to end his own story, Tony didn't celebrate. He simply stepped into the vacuum, one silent move at a time. No coronation, no gunfire. Just a reshuffling of power that no one even noticed until it was too late. That was the moment Antonino Accardo stopped being a soldier and became a strategist. He learned that control didn't come from the streets, it came from the systems that fed them. The unions, the docks, the casinos, the politicians, they were all gears in the same machine. And Tony made sure that every gear turned at his command. He never touched the powder or the pot himself, never dirtied his hands with the raw stuff, but the city flowed with it because of him. He knew the value of distance. He let others get their hands messy while he stayed clean, untouchable, invisible. The stuff moved like water under ice, smooth, steady, unstoppable. From the border towns of Texas to the hidden corners of Havana, from backroom poker dens in Vegas to the glittering lounges of Miami, the outfit's reach stretched far beyond Chicago. Accardo turned vice into infrastructure. Every shipment, every payoff, every corpse buried in the sand was part of a system so perfect it almost looked honest. The men who worked for him called him boss, but rarely to his face. He didn't demand loyalty, he inspired it. He paid on time, protected his people, and punished betrayal with surgical precision. No drama, no speeches, just the quiet, efficient certainty of cause and effect. He taught his crew discipline. Don't drink too much. Don't gamble what you can't afford to lose. Don't talk when you can listen. He built soldiers who could blend in with bankers, killers who looked like accountants. Under Accardo, the outfit evolved, from a street gang into a corporation. By the 1940s, Chicago wasn't just a city of vice, it was a business empire. And Tony was its silent CEO. He diversified. Bookmaking, labor unions, construction, casinos, each one feeding into the other. He turned chaos into profit, fear into order. He built relationships with senators and priests, cops and killers, all bound by the same invisible code: money and silence. And while the FBI hunted gangsters who flaunted power, Tony became something else, a ghost in a tailored suit. They had photographs of everyone else. For decades, there were barely any of him. He didn't leave fingerprints. He left legacies. He learned that the strongest empire isn't the one built on bullets. It is the one built on memory. Men die. Systems endure. When rivals disappeared or retired, Tony didn't ask questions. He already knew the answers. He understood balance. You don't rule by killing everyone. You rule by letting the right people live. He watched the outfit grow under his steady, invisible hand, transforming from a gang of street enforcers into an institution woven into the American fabric. Politicians called it corruption. Tony called it business. He didn't need to shout to command the room. His presence was enough. When he entered, conversations slowed. Men straightened their ties. No one ever dared to look too long, because they all knew what Tony Accardo had become. Not just a boss, but a student who'd mastered every lesson. And in his world, graduation didn't come with applause. It came with silence. By the dawn of the 1950s, Tony Accardo had become something more than a man. He was a presence, an invisible hand that shaped Chicago without ever needing to show its face. Reporters chased headlines, cops chased ghosts, and politicians chased votes. But none of them ever truly saw him. Tony was everywhere and nowhere, a shadow stitched into the fabric of the city. The Chicago outfit no longer needed machine guns in the streets or blood in the gutters. That was the old way, the noisy, messy theater of gangsters who mistook violence for control. Accardo evolved the business. He turned what had been a gang into an institution. The real weapons weren't guns. They were envelopes, contracts, and handshakes in smoke-filled backrooms. Judges were on payroll. Detectives were on retainer. Politicians took phone calls before they took oaths. Every nightclub, every union, every construction deal carried his silent approval. He didn't need to sign documents or give speeches. His word traveled through whispers and glances. If you wanted to move something in Chicago, money, liquor, stuff, anything, you needed the big Tuna's blessing. He ruled not from a throne, but from an armchair in his modest suburban home. While other mob bosses flaunted their wealth with furs and Cadillacs, Tony mowed his own lawn. Neighbors saw him as just another aging Italian man with a calm smile and steady hands. They had no idea that behind those quiet eyes was the architect of an empire. Accardo understood the art of contradiction. To the public, he was humble. To his men, he was absolute. He lived like a king, but a ghost king. No golden suits, no champagne toasts, no parties filled with celebrities. He found glory in control, in structure, in knowing that every corner of the outfit obeyed a rhythm only he could hear. He taught his soldiers the code: never talk, never show, never lose control. To him, self-discipline wasn't just a virtue, it was armor. Every gangster who'd fallen before had done so because they wanted to be seen. Capone wanted fame. Giancana wanted glamour. Accardo wanted permanence. He built a system so clean, so efficient, that it almost looked legitimate. The outfit's money flowed through casinos in Las Vegas, hotels in Havana, and labor unions across Chicago's South Side. They financed movie theaters, trucking companies, and even construction firms that built the same city they secretly owned. It wasn't organized crime anymore. It was organized power. He had accountants instead of hitmen, lawyers instead of thugs. But make no mistake, Tony still ruled through fear, just not the kind you could see. His enemies didn't find bullets. They found doors closed, bank accounts frozen, friends who suddenly turned their backs. His was a quieter form of violence, social, financial, surgical. When rival crews tried to muscle in, they didn't face shootouts. They faced extinction by starvation. No connections, no deals, no oxygen. Tony didn't kill people. He erased them from the map. The FBI called him the untouchable. They raided his house, expecting safes full of gold and blueprints of power. Instead, they found fishing rods, family photos, and neat ledgers with no incriminating words. One agent famously said, "He runs the city like a priest runs a parish. Everyone pays, everyone obeys, and no one talks." Behind closed doors, Accardo's temper was legendary. Calm didn't mean kind. He had a rule: never raise your voice unless you're ready to raise your hand. His men knew that betrayal wasn't forgiven, only delayed. A traitor might live a year, maybe two, thinking he'd been spared. But when the call came, there was no warning, no noise, just darkness. Still, those loyal to him lived well. He paid their bills, cared for their families, and expected their silence in return. Loyalty was currency, and Tony minted it in abundance. By the mid-1950s, Chicago wasn't a city with crime. It was a city built on crime, and every layer of it, from the factory floors to City Hall, carried Accardo's quiet signature. He had created something rare in the underworld: stability. While others were gunned down in parking lots and restaurants, Tony was eating dinner with his family, calm as ever. He'd learned that the real crown doesn't glitter, it disappears. Power doesn't demand attention, it survives it. Tony Accardo didn't need statues or songs. His monument was the system he built, a self-sustaining empire that would outlive its maker, because in his world, kings fall, legends fade, and names vanish into history. But the quiet ones, the ones who never talk, never show, never lose control, they become eternal. Time, like power, has no mercy. The streets that once echoed with gunfire and fear began to soften, paved over with new ambitions, new faces, new rules. But Tony Accardo, Chicago's big tuna, kept moving beneath the surface, steady, silent, and alive. Rivals were buried, protégés turned to ghosts, and the young men who once worshipped him grew old themselves, still whispering his name with a kind of awe that bordered on prayer. He had become the embodiment of what every gangster dreamed of and almost none achieved: longevity. In a world where most lives ended with bullets or betrayals, Tony endured. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He adapted. The decades rolled through like a slow procession. The 1940s bled into the 50s, the 50s into the chaos of the 60s, each new generation of law enforcement thinking, "This time we'll get him." But they never did. The outfit changed form, faces shifted, but the hand guiding it, the quiet, invisible hand, was still his. He didn't need to shout orders anymore. He didn't even need to show up. His word traveled faster than the telephone, heavier than the law. The FBI called him the last Don of Chicago. Reporters called him untouchable. To Tony, those titles meant nothing. He'd learned long ago that the moment you start believing your own legend, you're already dying. When Sam Giancana, his one-time protégé, became the flashy face of the outfit, Tony watched from the sidelines. Giancana loved the spotlight, the women, the cameras, the glamour of being seen. Accardo hated it. He called attention a disease. And when Giancana's body was found riddled with bullets in his own basement, Tony didn't say a word. He just nodded, as if the universe had reminded him that the rules never change. The old monster had become a ghost. He didn't haunt the alleys or the nightclubs anymore. He haunted boardrooms, golf courses, and country clubs. His enemies were no longer street rivals. They were bankers, judges, senators. He played the long game, betting on generations instead of hits. And still, the government never let go. FBI agents raided his home more than once, searching for the myth. They expected blood and maps and murder weapons. What they found instead looked like the spoils of an eccentric millionaire. Jewels, antique pistols, and stacks of cash hidden like secrets beneath the floorboards. One agent described it as a treasure chest of a man who didn't believe in banks. When they questioned him, Accardo didn't blink. He didn't plead the fifth, didn't fake outrage. He simply smiled, calm as the eye of a hurricane, and said, "I'm just a businessman." And in a way, he wasn't lying. His business just happened to be built on fear, silence, and absolute control. He never spent a day in prison. Not one. Subpoenas dissolved. Witnesses vanished. Cases collapsed. The system couldn't hold him because he'd built a world where every link in the chain was his. For all their badges and briefcases, the law was still playing catch-up to a man who'd already written the rules. As the years passed, Accardo began to slow, not out of fear, but out of mastery. He'd seen too many kings fall, too many names burned into headlines only to fade into oblivion. He didn't want to be remembered as a monster. He wanted to be remembered as inevitable. His family grew. His grandchildren called him Papa. Neighbors saw an old man with kind eyes feeding birds in his backyard. They had no idea they were looking at the last architect of America's criminal golden age. Capone was long dead, eaten by madness. Nitti was a memory. Giancana was dust. The legends had fallen one by one, but Tony still breathed. The last of the old gods, sitting quietly among mortals who didn't even know they lived in his shadow. The city around him changed. Skyscrapers rose, highways cut through old neighborhoods, and new hustlers flooded in with their powder and their crystal, thinking they were inventing crime. But none of them understood that the blueprint had already been written decades before, by a man who taught the world that real power doesn't roar, it endures. Tony Accardo aged like the city itself, wiser, harder, quieter. The scars of his world were buried under concrete and history, but his name still pulsed beneath it all, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Because monsters, the real ones, don't die young in alleys or explode in headlines. They live long enough to watch their empires turn into legends. and their legends turn into myths. And when they finally fade, it isn't with a bang, it's with a whisper. In the end, death came to Tony Accardo not in a rain of bullets or the echo of betrayal, but in silence. In 1992, the man who had survived wars, raids, and decades of blood simply lay down and never woke up. No guards, no guns. Just the quiet exhale of a man who had outlived everyone who ever tried to kill him. He died in his sleep, peacefully, privately, untouched. For a gangster, that wasn't just an ending. It was a victory. No police sirens, no front-page shootout, just a line in the obituaries that called him a reputed organized crime figure. But to those who knew, to those who had once whispered his name with fear or reverence, that simple line carried the weight of an empire. Accardo's death marked the end of an era, the last breath of the old world mob, the one built on loyalty, silence, and unbreakable codes. The streets he once ruled had changed, paved over by new kinds of criminals, the loud ones, the reckless ones, the kind who measured power in noise and headlines. Tony never understood that kind of arrogance. To him, true control was invisible. Power that can be seen can be destroyed. Even after his passing, the blueprint he created still pulsed through Chicago's veins. The unions, the casinos, the politicians, so many of them still carried traces of the outfit's old structure. Quiet bosses, hidden empires, money that moved without names or faces. Every handshake, every bribe, every deal done behind closed doors bore the echo of his discipline. He left behind no memoirs, no confessions, no regrets. His silence was absolute. His final lesson to the world he built: speak less, last longer. The young mobsters who came after him studied his methods like gospel. They copied his restraint, his patience, his rule of invisibility. But few could truly live it. The new generation craved cameras, cars, chaos. They mistook fame for fear. Tony would have laughed at them. Men who shouted about loyalty while secretly recording their own crimes. He'd have called them amateurs. Accardo's genius wasn't in how many men he killed. It was in how many he never had to. His power was self-sustaining, an ecosystem of control that required no constant bloodshed to survive. He didn't just build a criminal empire. He built a system, one that operated with the precision of government, the patience of religion, and the reach of capitalism. Even the law couldn't deny his mastery. Retired FBI agents would later admit that he was the smartest man we ever chased. They could never catch him because there was nothing to catch. He didn't leave trails, he left influence. He didn't break laws, he bent them until they forgot their shape. To outsiders, he was a paradox. A murderer with manners, a criminal with conscience, a man who smiled while burying empires. But to those who understood power, Tony Accardo was the prototype, the quiet architect behind the mythology of organized crime. He had proved something most men never dare to believe, that the deadliest men aren't the ones who yell, but the ones who never raise their voice. The myth of the Big Tuna didn't end with his death. It simply changed form. His name still circulates in Chicago's undercurrent, passed in bars and alleyways like a ghost story. Every time a judge gets a call that changes his mind, every time a deal goes through that shouldn't exist, his shadow flickers at the edge of it. Because Tony Accardo was never just a man. He was a system that learned to breathe without him. And that's the thing about monsters who grow old. They don't die. They dissolve into the walls, into the whispers, into the DNA of the cities they built. Today, his mansion in River Forest still stands, quiet and immaculate, as if waiting for its master to return. The lawn is trimmed, the windows are spotless. Time has moved on, but the air around it carries something heavy, something that feels like memory. Tony Accardo's life wasn't a story about crime. It was a study in power, patience, and the art of survival. He showed the world that the most dangerous predator isn't the lion roaring in the jungle. It's the one watching from the shadows, unseen, unchallenged, eternal. Because in the end, power doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to last. He wasn't the loudest monster in the room. He was the one they never saw coming.